Thank you very much for being here. We're delighted to see a full house this morning. Well, that was short and sweet. Here we have, we're very delighted to have the Rugby Toulon Club is taking such a great interest in this initiative. And and we would like to congratulate on that. I'd like to leave you a few minutes just to tell us a little bit more about this subject, because everyone here is very interested in the sea. Hello, everybody. So in a couple of words, as you saw in the video, our goal in this Neptunalia program is going to be based here at the Neptune Congress Center. So what although we're not very inventive all the time, we are very committed. We're coming up with some events to heighten awareness. And I wanted to tell you about a congress which will be on the 21st of May next year. We're currently building the program, working with industrialists, institutions, associations, and businesses, so that we can get as many points of view as possible. That's what we really want to do. That's the whole driver. And we want to be focusing on the environment rather than geopolitics, as is the reason which brings us here today. So thank you very much for allowing me to say these few words, and we look forward to seeing you then, 21st of May, or even before then, in Mayol. Well, thank you very much for that great initiative. Okay, so here we go. Thank you very much for being here. I apologize to all of those who are standing in the room. We didn't realize that we were going to be such a huge sellout here. Thank you very much for being so interested in this question. This subject of the seabed, if we look over history and recent events, we see that the seabed is a place of turmoil at the moment. Things are moving very, very fast. It's very fast for people working on the seabed and also for technologies pertaining to the seabed. We're going to talk about new technologies, of course, and these technologies can render the seabed more accessible. Right now, we are realizing that there are new environmental challenges. We're going to address those. Our generations have talked about many different things, but now we're talking more about the environment. So the seabed is at risk of a crisis. There are new threats in our world, and there is a global crisis in the world. So there's a lot to talk about and a lot to learn. So well done for choosing to come to this round table. So will this round table answer all of the questions? Well, we'll find out soon enough. And we hope that Slido will help us to identify the most pertinent questions. So for this round table, I have the great honor of presenting to you some of our major French experts on the seabed. There are others in the room whom I can see here, but we can't get everybody on the stage. First of all, I would like to present to you our ambassador, Olivier Guillenvache, who is French ambassador to Jamaica, and he is the permanent representative of France to the International Seabed Organization. We'll be talking about that a little bit. And he knows Montego Bay, and he lives there. So it's a privilege for him, I would say. He's a very important man for those reasons, and also because he was at charge of the law of the sea and polar issues here in France. When he left his job, I was asking him where he was going to go, and he said, "I am going to be general consul in France in Wuhan." That was at the time when Wuhan didn't mean anything to us at all. It was just a small town in China, 24,000 inhabitants, and he was really on the front line during the COVID crisis, and he followed that crisis from the beginning right through to the end. But that is not what we're here to talk about today. I also have the pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Nicola Medzuki, who is Director of Research at the Center for Marine Strategic Studies, and he is a high-level advisor in questions of raw materials and commodities and cyber strategies. He's got a PhD in economic geography, and so he's got lots of knowledge to share with us. And we have two other men who are very impressive. If we take a look at their CVs, we've got Alain Fidani, who's with us here. He's the Director of Partnerships and Innovation with Exail, which is a combination of ECA and X-Blue, if you've not watched the news recently. So his career has always focused on robotics, underwater robotics, and the seabed. So he really is a wonderful engineer, and France is very proud of him. And to round up our panel, we have the gentleman who has spent a lot of time underwater, and I'm talking about Marc Delorme. He had a career as a submarine officer, and he was in charge of an underwater, of a nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine. And he's worked for Thales, where he is the submarine product line manager, and he is working on surveillance of the seabed, amongst other things. And in fact, today, Mark, you were at the head of underwater drones at Thales, if I'm not mistaken. So there we have our panel. So time is limited, so we're going to get down into the nitty-gritty of our debate. So the very first question which I'd like to put to you is to Olivier Guillaume-Var, the ambassador, French ambassador to Jamaica. Can we say today that with France's recent call to expand coalitions against mining in the seabed, are we at a turning point in that project which dates back to the 1970s? Mr. Ambassador. Hello. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thierry, thank you very much for inviting me to be here. When you invited me, I definitely wanted to accept your invitation. First of all, to share my message, but also I think I've always wanted to be in charge of the law of the sea with my rubber boots on. We want to get the real world sorted out. And to do that, you have to know the real world. Sadly, I haven't had the privilege of being a captain of a submarine, Captain Nemo, but I'm sure with all of our experts on the panel, we will manage. So, exploring on the seabed, we have seen these polymetallic modules at the end of the last century. People were interested in that in the 70s and 80s, and we found that there were some models there for future years, but that transpired not to be the case. The Montego Bay Convention followed on in 82, and it entered into force in 94. And that convention created an independent international organization. And I'm underlining this because every time I read this in the press, they say that the International Seabed Organization, it is not part of the United Nations. It annoys me when I read that in the press. There are 97 organizations involved, and it's based in Kingston, not Montego Bay, and Kingston is less chic than Montego Bay, but we're in Kingston, and it came into force in 96. So this International Seabed Organization has a legal mandate on seabeds and on mineral resources found there, both solid and liquid in form. We're not talking about liquids today. That's far too down underneath the seabed for petrol, and gas as well. But we're talking about all mineral resources. These are these polymetallic nodules. They're like pétanque balls, if you like, which are deep down on the fractures at the bottom of the South Pacific, which is the richest zone, but there's also some in the Indian Ocean. We have polymetallic sulfurs, which are the former chimneys of that have been extinguished since then. And then we've also got some cobalt, which is like a crust, 30, 40, 50 centimeters on the base of the seabed. And all of these are resources of rare earth that we need for the ecological transition. And today they are controlled by 97%, which is China, which is a partner of ours, of course. So here we have over 50% of the surface of our planet has mineral resources that are very, very abundant. I'm saying that that's because this is the zone, the big zone with a capital Z. Doesn't necessarily mean Zorro, but it means a big zone, which is beyond jurisdiction zone. So we go beyond these 2,000 miles at the open sea. So in the early noughties, certain exploration codes were adopted for these mineral resources in the zone. We started by protecting the marine environment, but here we have, I don't want to break your hearts or anything, but the operational side has not yet started. We have not started to exploit these mineral reserves for several reasons. Firstly, the technologies to go and collect them are not yet mature. One company, metal company, carried out a mining test, live, real scale, but it was very, very complicated to go and get these nodules 5,000 meters down below and bring them up through those water columns. It's it's even more complicated to do it and respect the environment at the same time. So these technologies are not really mature, and in legal terms, we have not yet drawn up the mining code. If that mining code reaches maturity, it will be a historical event. This will be the very first time in the history of mankind that an activity is regulated before it has started. Farming, fishing, hunting, they've existed since Neolithic times, but it was only very recently that we introduced regulations for those activities. But here, we are regulating a business activity before it starts. One might hope that this activity will be regulated in a reasonable manner. Then, necessarily, we will damage the environment. We are working article by article, word by word. The authorities gather 3 times a year for the past 2 or 3 years, working on this code, so a lot of work has already been completed. And inside this authority, there are several political fracture lines about this future activity. There are 36 members of this board, this council, which have been selected. Most of those 36 members, or I would say the union, most of them, they've adopted 2 major decisions. There will be no work without a mining code. And that mining code has to protect the environment sufficiently. So people were worried that the activity would start before we'd written that mining code, but there was a consensus about that. There would be no work carried out until the mining code has been completed. And then we've got a coalition. Thierry mentioned this, 22 states. Although the figure changes from one day to the next, the United Kingdom has just announced, just last week, that it will be for a moratorium. So we've got a coalition launched by France. France is at the lead of this, to establish at least one moratorium or precaution. As things stand today, these are not legal words, legal terms, but each person interprets them differently. So the precautionary approach means no work carried out before the code is written, but above and beyond that, before we are scientifically sure, before it's been proven scientifically how we're going to, we don't know how we're going to get that scientific data, but until we have scientific guarantees that that activity will respect the environment. So a moratorium could be more or less the same thing, or it could be that we will not start work before the next 10, 20 or 30 years. So the NGOs will interpret that as they will. So we've got the Sharm el-Sheikh COP. The French president said that France was for banning any work on the seabed. The legal experts were saying, well, how can you ban something which has been authorized by the Montego Bay Convention, and for which many states have already signed Montego Bay, because there will be possibilities for working there, particularly developing countries, because it's all part and parcel of the humanity's heritage. The oceans belong to everybody, but heritage means money. And if one day we work there, some of the profit must go to be shared by those developing states and the most underprivileged states. So that is the very concept of that convention, which was started back in the 70s. But since then, that we've got these developing states which are for work in these zones because they will have that right to share the profits that come from the work. So the president of France said that it's too early to plan any work that will damage the environment. We don't want 30, 40, 50 years down the line. We don't want the debate that we're having today on instant damage on the environment could come to the surface again. We don't have enough scientific knowledge on the environmental impact. We are in zones where man has never been before. The seabeds are virgin territory. We know less about the seabeds than we know about the moon. And so there are too many dangers, there's too much uncertainty to start working on the seabed. Well, thank you very much for all of that information. Let's come back to that later on about this moratorium or the ban and the conditions for working on the seabed. We'll talk about that later on. I would now hand the floor over to Nicolas Mazuki. The interesting thing with Nicolas is that he has a geo-economical view, and my question to him is, the seabed is, are people wanting increasingly to go to the seabed and exploit it? Hello, everybody. Yes, that's true, but the dynamics are quite different from one party to the next. And just to round off on what has already been said by the ambassador, there really is this economic, this profitability notion, which is at the heart of all of this. And that's one of the reasons, above and beyond the law, which will govern the use of the mining resources there. It's the question of the lack of economic profitability, or the notion of saying, before we go and look underneath the sea, perhaps we should exhaust what we've got on Earth. China has the majority of the rare earths, for example, and there's some in South America. Also, perhaps we should go and exploit what's on Earth before we start rummaging around under the seabed. As for the economic question pertaining to the seabed, this is not a new question. When you take a look back, the questions of telecommunications cables, for example, which are more visible in the media. This is something which existed since the end of the 19th century, when there were the British-American cables, the transatlantic cables, which continue to be the main zones for developing the volumes of telecommunications cables, but also in the question of energy. Here, we're not talking about any innovation here at all, because in the middle of the 1960s, there was a new wave of offshore oil and gas, because here we are we were suffering the first petrol crisis. Before that time, we weren't worried about going where it was cheapest or easiest. The question was onshore petrol from the OPEC countries. One of the keys to the diversification of by these big international oil companies was to go and look for countries which were not in OPEC, new geographical zones, including the sea. And with a lot of development since the 1980s, we realize that today, when we see the segmentation between oil production on land and on the sea, at the end of the 1990s, we see a lot more sea production, and the increasing demand is satisfied by offshore oil production. And since the beginning of the 2000s, there was ultra-deep offshore, i.e. production which goes more than 2,000 meters down. So we're developing volumes and types. If you take a close look at oil and gas, in the 1970s, we started going to about 10, 20 kilometers off the coast. If we look at the major wells which have been developed in Brazil from the second half of the 2000s, we see that we are 50 kilometers off coast, 3,000 kilometers down, 3,000 meters down, and it was profitable. But if we want to have oil and gas offshore and renewable marine energy with wind turbines, we see that there is a shift towards the high seas and to lower depths. And that really is the what's new. The seabed is being of interest today because we've got oil and gas there, which are down below. It's not obviously not on the surface. You have to go down below the crust. We've got these turbine parks, which are shifting out towards the high seas. And here we are 150 kilometers off the coast of Europe. So these are items which are going to be based down on the seabed, such as the cables. We've got these telecommunication cables, which are being developed not necessarily in terms of the number of cables, but in the volumes which are transported by each cable. To give you an idea, the biggest Google cable is 250 terabytes per second, and that's instead of those old cables which were 25 times less powerful. So we're not putting more cables down there, but we're putting bigger cables down there. In terms of strategy, we realize that there is this multiplication of objects which are more increasingly critical and are not really, what we don't analyze are these questions of electric cables and cables for interconnections in Europe. We've got a lot of these electric transmission cables under the sea, in the Baltic Sea specifically, which has enabled Denmark to develop its wind farms on land and in the sea, and that was because it was interconnected with Norway and could provide Norway with low-cost electricity. And that meant that Denmark, because it was interconnected, Denmark could grow very quickly. We've got the interconnection growth, which is going further afield, further down. We've got the Celtic interconnector between Ireland and France, and that is a very long cable. We've got cable projects which will go beyond the European Union to the Eastern Mediterranean. We've got the Euro-Asia interconnector project between Greece, Cyprus and Egypt. So we really do have a multiplication of objects down there. In the digital field, we've got players who now are wondering if they could not submerge their data centers to keep them cool. So here we are developing business activities on the seabed, but above and beyond that, we're developing critical infrastructures down there. Energy is critical, telecommunications are critical. So here we are developing critical services down there on the seabed above and beyond the economic question. If we take it from a strategic point of view, then that is really the big event over the last 5-10 years. Things are much more critical. Well, very interesting. So Alain Fidani and Marc Delhomme, this is an amazing world which we're seeing coming into view. Alain Fidani, so in your opinion, what will the consequences be of all these technological advances in terms of the new tools which will enable you to develop different ranges, and what are the ranges that you are currently developing, and what kind of technological disruption are you coming up with at Exail? Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Thierry. I'm delighted to be part of this round table. We've got a video which we'll put on in the background there. There's no sound to it, but it will illustrate what I'm going to be saying to you. We've got two autonomous devices, one on the surface and one on the marine bed. It's called a 18. So these are two vehicles which work together. To come back to Thierry's question, I'd like to say a few words, first of all, about the company Exail, because as you can see the pictures which are illustrating what we're talking about. And we've got a lot of experience over the last 10 years. We've noted the acceleration which you talked about in terms of using autonomous systems. So Exail is a new company, really, but it is inherited from two companies, Ithaca and X Blue. And because of their fusion, we can say that Exail is the world leader in the area of robotics and autonomous devices in the sea. Exail is a high-tech French company, 1,500 employees, with turnover above 250 billion, and a large percent of that is export. And on a regional terms, we have 500 people who work in our region, the Mediterranean. We've got a key centre in Toulon, but we've also got an agency at Cisfour, and there's one at La Ciotat also, and also Marseille. So Exail is very firmly anchored here in the south. We've got 4 main hubs specialising in different fields, one of which is aeronautics, and one is land systems, one is maritime systems, and that's what we're talking about here today. So I will dwell on that particular hub. At that hub, we develop technologies which, for different markets, defense, civil, oceanography, hydrography, science as well, and also industrial projects to satisfy the needs of the industrialists, oil and gas, and the renewable marine energy sector. At Exail, our unique feature is that we are dual, if you like. The solutions which we develop today are autonomous systems that are dual systems that can be used both for defense and in civil uses. And that means that we can capitalize on our shared technological foundations. It's also important, as has been said already this morning, today there are hybrid threats facing us. We need to have dual systems to respond to those hybrid threats. And finally, it's also important to note the vertical integration of Exail in its technological value chain. We've got all kinds of components which head towards the equipment, the vector, and a system for systems. We've got this entire chain, and that means that we can optimize our performance levels, our competitiveness for our clients. For France, that is a guarantee of sovereignty. So that's my introduction to Exail. Now, to get back to the question, I would say that what we're experiencing is unbelievable acceleration in terms of our market. A few years back, we were selling autonomous systems, a few units per year, and now for 3 or 4 years, things have been picking up speed. Why? Well, we've got an intensification of human activities on the seabed, as has already been described in detail, and at the same time, we've got the technological maturity, which means that our clients can now carry out operations for commercial ends and provide a lot of advantages. We're gaining in performance levels, we're gaining in terms of the quality of data which we collect, we're gaining in terms of the savings for operating costs, which means that our clients can go out to sea more frequently, collect data more frequently, with a very small impact on the environment when you compare to classic methodology. So this means that we can feel this acceleration. I will just wrap up with 3 key examples which illustrate what I've just said. First example, some of you will be familiar with this, but so apologies if this is old news to you. There's this contract with Belgium and Netherlands 4 years ago, in 2019. It really is emblematic. And this, I think, in all modesty, is the biggest robotics contract in difficult areas in the world, not only in the sea, but anywhere, because the Naval Group provides the equipment for our Dutch and Belgian clients, and we provide all of the drones that will carry out all of the detection missions, classification, identification, and neutralization of mines, whilst remaining remote. The human beings are remote, and it means that this kind of task can be carried out much more quickly than in the past. And that represents about over 100 drones, which we were delivering from 2026 all the way through to 2030. There's a huge volume of drones which have never been met before. So we've got these different projects underway, and we hope the contracts are going to be signed in coming years. The second example, which you can see, is the DRIX on the screen there. That's that red thing on the surface, which is an autonomous vehicle which can be steered from someone who's on land via satellite. And it's got amazing ability. It's very stable, and it has got all kinds of sensors on it, acoustic, physical, chemical, capped sensors, etc. And so it can carry out scientific, hydrographic, oceanographic missions, etc. It's very, very versatile. And over the past 3 or 4 years, we sold about 20 of those, more than 20 of these prestigious vehicles. So we're very, very kind. We've sold the Ocean Infinity. I'm sure people will be familiar with that company. Ocean Ring has bought one as well, which are leaders in the oil field, and also science institutions in the United States. We've sold just 2 the other day. So there we are seeing that those sales speeding up as well. And we also have worked with FMES. For over 40 years, we've worked with FMES, and they work on the seabed, of course. for over 40 years now. We started back in the 1980s with Ipola, which is the first autonomous vehicle, which was down at a deep depth, taking photos at the bottom of the seabed, thousands of meters under the sea. And now we're working on Ulix, which is the most recent addition to that French fleet.
This enabled us to develop a vehicle with exceptional characteristics, which can be in a stationary positioning and can carry a whole series of sensors. This vehicle is currently being qualified. It was delivered in December 2020. At the end of September, it carried out a mission enabling it to reach this depth of 6,000 meters. And this is the emblematic example I wanted to end with today. Yes, I was lucky enough to see it at FMES. This is an impressive piece of technology. So, Marc Delorme, how do you see this technological acceleration? What are the products that Thales is offering in this field of underwater systems, and how do you see future developments? I'm very honored to be here and to have this opportunity to talk about our activities at Thales. We can put the video on for showing Thales activities. You won't see much about our specific subject in the video. In fact, Thales is a very big group. I'm representing a small entity in that which is in Sophia Antipolis, which is dedicated to underwater and underwater sonic technology. We've been working in this field more than 50 years in deep sea area. We've been quite complementary to what Excel was presenting, showing that Thales, we're not working on platforms, we're working on these sensors and the data processing from these sensors and the autonomy of the missions linked to these sensors. So typically, in the mine warfare drone program of the French Navy, for example, where Thales is providing all of the systems, we are using the Excel vehicles where Thales installs its sensors and we carry out the data processing. These sensors today enable us to better understand the volume and the deep sea. It's a question of acoustics. For the physicists amongst you, acoustics is one of the main means of collecting data on the deep sea. Often other systems are unable to penetrate into the marine environments. Optics is attenuated. So if we want to have a large distance and be able to circulate information, it is very much a question of acoustics. These acoustics are used in the sensors that today are exploring through acoustic imagery. You may have seen some examples of it in the Excel video. The acoustic imagery is something you've seen at the hospital when you go to have an ultrasound examination in the hospital. This uses acoustic imagery. We use this also, and just to give you an example, today we have a precision of pixels of 1.5 centimeters by 2 on a width of 200 centimeters. So this is quite impressive, and at the same time, it's not very much at all when you compare it with the scale of the oceans, of course. If you have a foci of 300 meters, this means you have a very high speed, and it means you have huge areas still to be explored. But nevertheless, this is a very precise definition with 3D views that we can provide from different angles for each pixel of the data. This enables us to recreate data processing upon completion, to recreate objects in 3D, and to apply onto this a whole series of intelligent processing and processes that I'll explain to you in a moment. We on Thales is very much focused on this kind of imagery. There are other sensors that use innovations that it can be mounted on these vehicles. Anna has mentioned this. We have electromagnetic imagery, which we don't do, but other companies do, which is also starting to give good resolutions. We can create an image using the disruptions of the electromagnetic field of the vehicle over about 10 or about a dozen meters around the vehicle. The video that you can imagine that will provide very high definition, but there's a quite limited range. Even with powerful lighting systems, it only covers about a few dozen meters, depending on the turbidity of the water. Then you have all of the sensors in the scientific field, which enable it possible to have precise measurements. These are subject to development as well. So all of these sensors today I think, have reached a level of performance which makes it possible to have a good level of knowledge and understanding of the physical parameters in the volumes and in the deep sea, but with ranges of detection which remain quite limited. When you look at the challenge of the 6 million square kilometers of sea that we know of. So the protection and defense, we find these applications mainly on mobile vehicles. We also find them on fixed installations for exploration of the deep sea. We shouldn't forget the fixed installations as well. I'm not talking about defense, but also typically for FMES, for example, in its France 2030, is equipping the Mayotte vessel with a whole network of optical sensors to digitalize the Mayotte volcano eruptions. So this uses a fixed network which we're able to put in the seabed. And then if we're talking about the seabeds and deep sea beds, mobile systems are useful and unmanned systems are very useful as well, because deep sea environments are very difficult and hostile for man. And so we use mobile systems and unmanned mobile systems. That's why drones are so important. And we are using those to go into these environments. But if we're talking about drones going into the deep sea field, we come up against the difficulty of the electromagnetic propagation I mentioned earlier. So the communications are a big problem in order to develop these underwater drones and for this exploration of the deep sea. So we shouldn't only look at the communication triptych, you should only look at communications, a triptych, communication, autonomy, and real time. And it's these three parameters that we will use to be able to get a good definition of the vehicle and the systems we want to put on the vehicle. What I mean is that for an industrial need, we have a field of wind turbines that needs to carry out a survey of the area to install its masts. We are able to do this at present. We have drones that can survey the area. There are no unknowns. If there's a problem, the drone comes back up to the surface. In real time, there's no communication problem. We record and we analyze, and there's no delay. For the scientific world, it's pretty similar. We're able to carry out a lot of visions today with many different sensors that have already been mentioned, and we're able to deploy the pre-programmed mission. And in the same way, if we have an unexpected event or something that is complicated, the vehicle comes up to the surface, we stop the mission, and then we start again. Then there are more complicated situations when we're looking at real time. Then, of course, we're thinking about operational missions. In real time, if you're in real time, this means either you have to use communication. In other words, we would like to remote control the vehicles constantly. In other words, be able to bring the flow of information to the surface and give humans a possibility to remotely control this vehicle. So you have to have a big flow of communication and data in both directions. And in the marine environment, this is not possible because of the electromagnetic problems we have. The best form of communication is acoustics, and although acoustics can cover long distances, the rate, the data capacity remains low, and this remains the main factor. We can use optic communication underwater using lasers, but that's only a very small, short range. We can also use communication through electromagnetic means, but the rate is very slow. The data rate is very slow, very small as well. And as this is becoming, communications is becoming an important issue for exploration of the deep sea. So if we're not able to establish this communication, autonomy becomes a requirement. It's not by choice that we are developing autonomy for deep sea. It's a requirement because of this difficulty of communication. And so autonomy now is the main challenge for our deep sea exploration if we want to be able to have better means and have more responsive systems, because if you're sending a vehicle to 6,000 meters down, it has to go up 6,000 meters to send its data, that's not going to be very effective. So we need to give these vehicles much more autonomy, and that is the current challenge that we are all working on. And typically on this kind of acoustic imagery I was mentioning earlier, with this kind of precision we have today, the vehicles today are capable of classifying the images and deciding that it's a particular kind of object because they've learnt using AI, and they are capable of returning to a point to repeat a different kind of view or analysis of the situation. They're capable of readjusting the navigation by recognizing from one run to another the difference in the previous run that they've done within a few centimeters. They might have done a few months ago. And they're also capable of readjusting their navigation based on known positioning points on the seabed. So we're moving to a very interesting stage in data processing to make these missions more accessible and increase the autonomy of these vehicles. This is going to be the major challenge to be able to multiply the means and increase the capacity. So there's a big change taking place thanks to AI. We can see it. So we can have two sequences of 10 minutes. Time is going past very quickly. I want to have one last half an hour for questions. If you don't have questions, I have plenty. So first of all, I'd like to talk about threats, and then we'll talk about exploitation of seabeds and the environment. The first point. This is up to our first engineers, first of all, and then I'll ask Nicolas to say a few words about the French strategy for protecting its interests. The two engineers. The question is, today, in terms of defense, do we need to take the threat of underwater drones seriously? We've seen what happened in Ukraine. These are underwater drones. These were naval drones. Isn't there a risk of having a strategic surprise in this area? What is your opinion on this? And how can we counter this possible threat? Yes, absolutely. I think, first of all, we have to take this threat seriously. A drone is a solution, and at the same time, it can be a threat. It's a solution because thanks to drones and their autonomy, we're going to be able to increase our capacities and inspect critical infrastructure that we've described earlier, to be able to also collect sensitive wrecks that we don't want competitors to recover. So this can be done more easily using drones and different types of drones. You can have autonomous drones do a first run and carry out the detection, and then once you've identified and located the object, then you can use another type of drone, another type of robot, in fact, which will be remote controlled with manipulation capacities, which will be able to deal with the threat either by eliminating it or by recovering it. So yes, I think that drones and autonomous systems are a solution, and vice versa, they can be a threat for several reasons. Today, we are in a world of hybrid threats, where there is competition and increasing disputes of areas of the sea, and so the increasing distribution of this kind of technology. We see some private companies which even today are proposing unmanned robots for yachting. So these capacities are increasing. An announcement, FMES is organizing with the university on the 24th of November a symposium on yachting robots. Just that reminded me of that. There's a phenomenon of increasing use and widespread use of these systems, and there's a problem of capacity. With a level of technological maturity, which is quite proven now, these drones really can do things that can cause big problems for our critical infrastructure. I think we have to take the threat seriously. There are countermeasures do exist, and there are countermeasures as well. Marc Delorme. Before 9/11, nobody had imagined this could have happened. After 9/11, a lot of scenarios had been developed to imagine the worst that could happen in terms of terrorist attacks. And now this has calmed down a bit because there have been less use of these vehicles in this way. And then we had Nord Stream recently with that incident where the infrastructures were attacked. And Nicolas already explained that there are a number of critical submerged infrastructures exist, and we realize they're very vulnerable. There is a proliferation of these vehicles. They're very accessible. Underwater jet skis, which are marine commando systems, are sold on internet. The submarines you mentioned, Thierry, the company that builds them is announcing that in 2030 it would have sold 1,000 of these. These are submarines that can go down to 3,000 meters. There was a dramatic and terrible example of the Titanic a few months ago with the terrible accident. But nevertheless, there is a market where they're able to sell seats on these vehicles for people to go down. And these vehicles could be used for dishonest and terrorist purposes, either by governments or by non-state entities. We don't know exactly what the characteristics of who could exactly use these. So there is underwater detection. Of course, we've been working on this underwater detection for 10 years, and we've been offering solutions to detect submerged threats, which could be drones, particularly on the entrances to harbors, and to protect gas infrastructures. Then you have the infrastructures as pipelines or electric cables or telecom cables. But it's true that it's complicated. It's much easier to buy a webcam and put it on a fence at the entry to a harbor and control people's badges. It's not very expensive and easy to do technically. With a technology that provides a level of efficiency when you go underwater, as I was saying earlier, detection is not easy underwater. Detection is not easy, and so you immediately have to use complicated and expensive systems. As long as you haven't had an accident, you just take out an insurance policy. And we're always, in these cases, this enables us to provide a certain level of protection in underwater environments. And these systems are very complex. Nicolas Mazuki, before we talk about the French strategy in this area, what is the kind of threat you see on these underwater infrastructures? Thank you very much. I'd like to come back just for a moment. I want to be too alarmist and say the worst is ahead of us. We don't know that. Nevertheless, if we look at the immediate past, so we look at the example of Nord Stream, what happened with Nord Stream? In fact, not very much. Let's be honest. It was an underwater gas line, which when it was attacked was not being used. The only impact was an explosion due to the residual gas that was in the pipeline. There was no pressure, and so the gas was immobilized in the pipeline. There are other ways of taking Russian gas to the European territories at that time. So in terms of strategy, it was very impressive in terms of perception, but in terms of the military strategic impact, it wasn't a huge problem. The problem that I've identified as an expert in energy is the problem of electric cables, because unlike an infrastructure that is carrying oil or gas, which is just a passageway, and if the passageway is destroyed, then you can build another one. When you're talking about an electric network has to be constantly balanced between production on one side and consumption on the other. If you cut the transmission, you create an imbalance upstream and downstream. That means you have a risk of creating a blackout upstream and downstream. Here we're talking about a different level of criticality. In the same way, today, I think we tend to exaggerate the risk linked to telecom cables underwater, which are very redundant in most cases, except in certain areas of the world, such as French Polynesia. There's only one cable that goes to Hawaii. But if you look at transatlantic communication between the US and Europe, there's so much redundancy that before you could really disrupt telecom communication between sides, you'd have to cut a lot of cables. This isn't to say that it's not possible, but depending on the sectors or the subsectors you look at, there's a kind of resilience that has been in place because the infrastructure has been multiplied or because they've been developed very recently. I take the example of electric transmission cables. There the criticality is much greater. So electric cables are particularly critical, and we have to look at this on a case-by-case basis. The energy transition that is taking place overall in the North Atlantic area and around the world, it means we have increasing electrification, which also leads to decentralization and modification of our grids. And this means we will have to ask ourselves the question. President Macron, in his speech at Belfort, announced the development of offshore wind with larger capacity by 2050. This also means that we have increasing criticality of the French electricity grid, looking increasingly based offshore and underwater, whereas at the moment it's virtually non-existent in terms of electrical production. This is what we have to bear in mind. If we look at the movement and this energy transition and digital transition, this means the risks will be greater in this area. And in that situation, Nicolas, what is the French strategy for the seabeds? What's interesting is to see how we what we mean by the control of seabeds. We have a common position with the US, which is that we can't separate the seabed from the water column. We're talking about the controlling the seabed, talking about everything beneath the seabed and the surface. So that's to say that when you are talking about adding the conceptual layers, you have to have different programs. What we're talking about is this French desire to have programs that will combine underwater autonomous drones to have a kind of constant surveillance and remote-controlled robots, which will take action on more specific points, thanks to the sensors on underwater drones. This will be combined with what already exists in terms of underwater warfare and mine warfare. This is another layer that is being added to the existing we already have in the French Navy and in our armed forces to create a kind of continuum. We're not separating, in strategic terms, the seabed from the water column. This isn't the case of all other countries. In France and in the US and most of the NATO countries, if not all, most of the countries have this same vision. Then what you have to say is that when you're talking about seabeds, what are we actually talking about? We're talking about depths of, first of all, 3,000 meters and then 6,000 meters. Why 3,000 meters? Because this enables you to reach about 78% of the seabeds around the planet. These seabeds have been mapped very precisely, more or less, to only about 3%. We only know about 3% of the seabeds around the planet. This means the first mission is to have this strategy, is to have better knowledge. At 6,000 meters, which is the ultimate aim, 95% of the seabeds are not known. The average depth of the Atlantic is 3,300 meters. So that gives you, that's the average depth, not the maximum depth. So we have to, it's a question of knowledge. What is the seabed like? And we need to map it, and then we need to monitor it. And then, as Mark was saying, we're talking about the complexities that are because of the triptych between vehicles that have autonomy, the precision of the sensor, and the mission system, where you have to invest and develop capacity. And in a case where there is a threat, then you have to intervene. You have to take action, and either to recover wrecks or to dissuade competitors from being there. So it's a strategy which is intended to be very integrated, and once more, not by creating a new element to this separate, by really integrating this into the vision of the water column, which integrates all of the capacities that already exist, particularly the mine warfare capacity, where we have strong expertise in France, and a number of allies have abandoned that. We've continued in mine warfare, and we're very happy to have done that. So very quickly, are there any other countries that have a seabed strategy that is similar to France, as published by the Ministry of the Armies? I'm thinking of Italy. In talking about a formally defined public policy, other countries are interested. I've talked about the US already, but a country like China, where we know they are very interested in seabeds, but not in terms of a formally defined public policy. There again, in terms of its marine strategy for 2022, it doesn't talk about seabed specifically. It is mentioned in a number of occasions, but it's no specific strategy. The interesting case is Italy, because at the divergence from France, where Italy has a very strong strategic focus on seabeds, but in fact it separates the seabeds from the rest of the water column. This is a separate area for them. The seabed is one thing, and water column is something else. It doesn't mean you don't have synergy and complementarities between the two, but conceptually, Italy has decided to separate the seabeds. And also, the Italians want to propose a NATO Center of Excellence dedicated to the issue of seabeds. So there we need to see how we can harmonize these different visions, which are fairly complementary, which can be divergent in a number of areas. Thank you. Now we'll move on to talk about resources of the deep sea beds. Our French ambassador in Jamaica, when he, in his position abroad, has a lot of responsibilities. There was COVID, and there was also the decision by the French president to ban exploitation of seabeds, even though France has been a pioneer in this area. Particularly with FMES, it has an economic area which is very large, the second largest economic zone in the world, including a continental shelf that is very large. So how do we explain the position of France to the AIFM, and how can we prepare the schools for this? Thank you, Thierry, for that. How can we prepare ISO for this? In multilateral negotiations, a good diplomat always has to wear two suits. Sometimes you leave the meeting with your suit in shreds. This has happened to me when the President of the Republic announced this position. We were rather surprised, and I was surprised as well, and I heard this announcement. It's a bit like when Professor Tournesol in Tintin has a machine that brushes the clothes, and everybody's a bit surprised at what happens in the end. He's referring to a Tintin episode. So in Montego Bay, we have the right to explore. No state or company can explore the deep sea beds without any formal contract. You have to have a contract with the ISO. You have to present your work plan, and over a period of 15 years, which is then renewed every 5 years, to show what you want to do. And the aim of these exploration contracts with the ISO is, in legal terms, to prepare for exploitation. And France has two contracts, a nodule contract and a polymetallic sulfide contract for the mid-Atlantic area. A number of governments have asked us, what are the French intentions? What do you want to do? Some governments have said, Mr. Ambassador, what are you doing in Salva? It was quite violent, and they were asking, is France going to give up on its exploration contracts? Of course, we fought very hard not to renounce exploration contracts. As a result, I had the first visit of a French minister to Jamaica over the last 33 years, which was the Minister of the Sea, Mr. Hervé Berlin, who came to visit us in July this year. And he wanted to explain the French position to us, and also he wanted to better understand what the ISO is. And this is a very successful visit on the multilateral level and also on a bilateral level, because on a bilateral level he met 4 other ministers during his visit lasting 2 days, and he was able to explain this French position. We were able to place the cursor very high, and this French position will be adopted in compliance with the law of the sea. Of course, Montego Bay, of course, gives a right of exploration and later a right of exploitation as well. But we wanted to explain this position and to say that today it's too dangerous and premature to envisage this kind of activity now. So we have fought very hard in July, because a number of other governments, we have this 2-year clause that we have talked about a lot in the press, that was triggered by one of the smallest states in the world. This is the beauty of multilateralism. A state that has less than 5,000 inhabitants, Nauru, imposed on the international community, didn't impose, but activated this 2-year clause, which is in the agreement of 1994, which says that a government can ask a mining code to be completed within 2 years after its request. Because Nauru has within it a private company with Canadian finance, which has developed a demonstrator and a first mining test, which, according to the company, has been very conclusive and positive. And so Nauru asked this mining code to be set up within the next 2 years by July 2021. We have come to that date now. The idea of Montego Bay is that if the mining code has not been completed, nevertheless, a company or a state can submit a work plan, and this work plan can be approved provisionally. And nobody knows what provisionally means in this context. It's a provision that is described in 15 lines in 3 paragraphs. It's rather mysterious. And according to these 15 lines, you could adopt this and start exploitation before the mining code has been adopted.
So a decision needs to be taken, and this all wrapped up in a complicated manner, saying that we've set a deadline. Oh, the first thing is that, firstly, there will not be any work without this code, so we sideline that danger. Secondly, we have managed to ensure that if a works plan were to be submitted before the code, then the mining code would take a look at the procedure, and if legal experts like proceedings, we don't have any proceedings as they are today. We don't know how we're going to proceed, and legal experts can be a bit kind of difficult sometimes. So it's kind of dissuasive, because if this island submits this work plan, and then that's more or less what's going to happen. So it will delay things even further. And with the date of 2025, meaning that in a perfect world, the mining code should be finished by 2025. However, this date is only a tentative date. So it's not chiseled in stone. It could be 2026 or 2027, but that's the first deadline that's been set. So these moratoriums and bans are in the name of protecting the environment and global warming, which is comprehensible. However, do we have any scientific studies that can form the foundation of such decisions? Or are these decisions for a ban or a moratorium, are there going to be scientific studies that are carried out to see what the impact is, to see whether it's a harmless activity? Where do we stand? For the moratorium, or this notion of precaution, it's a political stance. We don't have any legal decisions yet to implement them. We were talking earlier on about those 3% of the seabed that is known to mankind, really known to mankind, in fact. But if you take a closer look, I've done a few sums. I wanted to be a sailor, but my maths are too poor to enable me to be a sailor. So an engineer knows something about everything, and a diplomat knows nothing about everything. So there was about 0.4, 0.3% of the 30 exploration contracts that have been, and that really has been a driver for research, because when you want to explore, you need to know what the seabed looks like, you have to know about the resources and know how you can exploit those resources, and now you have to know what the environmental impact is going to be. So there are so many factors. Everything that we know about the seabed is due to these, to FMES, for example, and other organizations who are obliged. They have to feed back their scientific statistics. Do we know this? Is this a well-known fact? No, it's not. People don't know that. So when we're talking about the precautionary concept, if we have no certitudes, then we do not launch works. So that's a two-edged sword, of course. On the one hand, there's a convention for the protection of the Antarctic's flora and fauna. Australia and France have signed that. For about 10 years, we've got a marine protected area in the Arctic region. That's a project. But however, China and Russia are saying that we do not have enough environmental statistics to say that we need to protect that zone. But that's not where we're at right now. That's not what the debate is all about. All of the states in the board say that we do not have enough scientific data. There's a first mining test which was carried out now, and so we will henceforth be able better to analyze how things will pan out. Yeah, so this test was Nauru, but I don't think that they were local businesses that were behind that project, that test. Well, because we're talking about international law here, the explorers or the future explorers can be states, or some are state businesses. FMES is a public institute, but there are also some private institutions, such as your company, for example, or oil companies, that can be sponsored by a state. If the operator behaves poorly, the state then has to step in and regulate applying international law. And so the state, which is the sponsor of the company, takes the blame at the end of the day. So that's the case of Canada with a metal company, and that's how that's worked out. So which states are driving for exploration? So China, Canada. Who else is pushing? Well, the state isn't pushing. Canada just hopped on board this idea of a moratorium. So which are the states the most further forward? Well, France. France was one of the first states to launch its research. You've got states such as Germany, Belgium. Belgium has contracts also. Other leading states are China. For example, China has 5 contracts. They have the highest number for all 3 resources. So China really is taking center stage so that one day it will be able to work on the seabed. But for the time being, Russia has 2 contracts. Japan has 2. Korea, India is also doing well, including for the metal industry. Because once you've got these minerals, you have to transform them into ingots so they can be used by industry. So India's faring rather well there. And there are states which don't have the industry, but which are sponsoring private businesses. That's the case of Singapore, of Nauru, Kiribati, small states in the Pacific, Cook Islands as well. Cooks are going to give 3 contracts in their own economic zone. So there are small island states in the Pacific. The Pacific Islands are divided on this subject. Some want the ban, like Maratuatu. France and Vanuatu are on the same line there. Fiji's position changes. There are some states which Nauru and Kiribati are at the helm because their states do not have any resources. Like the Cook Islands, Minister Bevel met with us, and the ocean is their only resource, they say. Tourism, well, after 2 years of COVID, well, tourism resources have dried up. And so what with fishing and exploiting the seabed, well, there's nothing else, so let's go for the seabed. And so for 9,000 years, we've been living on these islands. They say, you Westerners have polluted the sea and the oceans. You're responsible for global warming. But we islands, we're disappearing. So now I have to find resources so that we can survive. So the seabed is important to us. We've been here for 9,000 years, and we are as concerned as you by protecting the environment. So that's the way things are going right now. So let's put up on the screen the questions. But while we're waiting for those questions, I've got a question for Nicola Mizuki. There is a gap. We see that the exploitation of resources is not economically viable. Yet we need to keep working on technology so that technology will be ready when the day comes. Well, let me come back to what Alan has just said. It's that question of that duality. Technology, the technology that we need in military, in scientific research, or in operations, it's a dual technology. When you see the main defense businesses in the States, for example, which are developing autonomous underwater drones, these are businesses that have grown by buying out businesses that made drones. That was the case of General Dynamics with Bluefin. They are created by the oil and gas industries because that was the industry that was at the base, at the forefront, or the reason for the development of these underwater drones. There are, because of this duality, because we've got military research in play, well, in my opinion, how can I put this? There is no real need to have operations for technology to develop. It all depends how far you want your technology to develop. Let's move on to these questions. Let's try and answer them quickly. My first question is for Mark. We're asking, how far is France lagging behind in terms of underwater drones when you compare to its competitors? Is it comparable to the air-based drones? Well, as I was saying earlier on, we don't make platforms, but what I can say, I can talk about the business model. Research has to attract finance so that we can dream up and build these things. However, in France and in Europe in general, we aren't very well off in terms of industrialists. The state has said that it is wanting to relaunch France. There's a plan called France 2030, and the FMES has got funding to equip France with a new autonomous vehicle for exploring the seabed. That is just one vehicle, one ROV also, and this is the only public resource available until 2030, so above and beyond that, there's quite a lot of funding and one-stop shops and research and development that we're all familiar with, BPI and Corimer and the ID. There's a lot of funding to try and develop research and innovation in SMEs, but we have not got the ambition that other countries have, such as Norway. On a national scale, Norway has taken up a position with its industrialists to really be ready to robotize the seabed. That's a really key point. Well, as things stand today, I think that France is in that race. We are at the cutting edge of autonomous vehicles on the surface and below the surface. We are encountering commercial success. I think that duality is so important. We started with IFREMER for scientific missions, going out to the poles back in the 80s. Today we're working with our ULIX, and we imagine that this exploration of the seabed is a market which is going to be very fruitful and profitable. There's a strategy to master the seabed, and we are positioned on that. We have a vehicle that we have designed specifically for that. As things stand today, yes, we are in the running. And including for autonomous drones, there is a study underway pertaining to how states are investing, and the different states are investing different amounts. If you take a look at Norway, well, Norway is an excellent example because over 50 years they've been working, they've been exploiting oil underwater, and so they can very easily transfer their knowledge base to exploiting the seabed. And the United States have many projects with lots of money to back them up as well. Thank you very much. Another question here. This might be for Ambassador or for all four of you, perhaps. Whoops, the question's disappeared off the screen. Let's take the questions. Whoops, my question has disappeared off the screen. There we go. Do we know the scope of funding that is mobilized by China, the USA, Russia, Europe, France to study and explore and exploit, in fact, the seabed, the very, very deep seabed? So, does America have a much bigger budget than France? Where does China stand? What can we say about that? This might be a bit of a difficult question because perhaps the amounts of money are kept secret and perhaps scattered over several programs as well. Well, I do not have the figures at my fingertips, sadly. But what I would say is that we've got 36 members of our board. Half of them, like 18, represent the entire many countries. We have 5 chambers there. France is always re-elected into the chamber of the main explorers, and that has been the case for a very long time. France is one of the leading investors. I really don't have the table of who invests what, but Japan and China are investing heavily. The States is very, very ambiguous there because they have, as the United States themselves, they don't have the right to go to some places, but there are some companies such as Lockheed, for example, which work with Singapore and Great Britain. In the United States, we speak more about the companies rather than the state. Alain? Yeah, well, from our modest standpoint, peeking out of our window, we see that the states are not investing enough, although a lot of efforts have been made recently in different projects. However, the most recent project we were involved in was Espadon with Thales and others. That was 10 years ago. As a SME, we haven't had access to funds to develop our technologies. And as I said at the outset, 80% of our turnover comes from exports. So, and it's abroad that we found opportunities that have enabled us to develop our technology. So that's not satisfactory. And of course, Europe and Europe's defense hub is an opportunity also for funding for R&D at a modest scale, but it's worthwhile all the same. And every year we participate in these calls for projects, and we are part of consortiums in Europe that are often in the lead for these calls for projects, and that means that we can work on different projects. So a study has been carried out on the seabed in the Mediterranean, and they concluded that there is a real problem of interministerial coordination here. And so there's been a call for better coordination so that we can really move forward. So a question for Nicolas. So what are we doing to protect our economic zones from piracy on the seabed? Talking about China, for example, without having the boats to be out there and scour the horizon. Okay, let's imagine how China could attack pirates. Perhaps they'd send underwater drones to get our polymetallic nodules. But that would be very tricky to do. And technologically speaking, I think it's impossible. So that would mean that if China were to do that, which it can't, it would use a surface boat as a base. And so if there's a surface boat as a base, then we are entering into the sea law, and we are talking about the admiral who's in charge of the Pacific. The French Navy is in Polynesia and does its control routes. At the time being, without being committed to monitor and intervene on the seabed, for the time being, if we're in this scenario, then it will be on the surface of the sea that we were talking. Let me come back to a small detail. For the time being, the way we are approaching things is talking from the surface downwards. But what we need to understand when we're talking about the seabed in a more global scale, it doesn't work that way. It goes from the outer space all the way down to the seabed. So there's a question of satellite surveillance to see what subjects are on the surface of the sea, what objects are potentially dropping drones or payloads into the sea. And from that point on, we could say how strangely there's a big vessel there on the sea. Has it released items into the sea, onto the seabed? So controlling the seabed is not restricted to the water column. It goes beyond that. It's very transversal, and that is it covers the entire naval strategy. Yes, there was a question about maritime insurance there. So the moratorium on exploring the seabed, which has been backed by the France, is that not closing off a strategic and economic opportunity for France? A question to the ambassador. An excellent question. Thank you very much for putting that question. No, it's not closing those doors, because we have industrialists who are developing technologies to explore. The moratorium or the ban mean that there is an increase in scientific data, and we need more scientific data. We need more knowledge. And you've talked about Abissa, one of your competitors, which is a member of the Maritime Cluster. Last year, we had the Maritime Cluster included as an observer at the ISO, and so we have a representative there in our cluster. And with Abissa, we had a side event, and it came to present its technology and explain how it would be able to launch drones that would act in a pack to collect data. It was very interesting because we were wondering about surveillance. So if one day operators are going to operate there, we're going to have to monitor them and make sure that what they are doing corresponds to what they're supposed to be doing and that they don't go off track. And so why not use drones? They're kind of the sheepdogs, if you like, down there on the seabed, to make sure that people are respecting the regulation. So on the contrary, French businesses and French technologies will be deployed. If I could just chime in there about Abissa, it's a partner of ours. Abissa is a partner. We work with them to develop these packs of drones to enhance our capacities to explore vast expanses of the seabed. And so we provide tools and equipment to Abissa. They're our partner. Another question, which is slightly more tricky, listen to this one. The need for autonomous systems is going to be vital to protect our critical resources. This is a question. This is a new paradigm. What kind of game changers are we to anticipate? Mark, perhaps you'd like to start this one. Shall I read it again? Yeah, how do we take decisions, different decisional autonomy and supervised? That echoes what I was saying earlier on. If we hope to send intelligent devices that can react to what they see or to what they are measuring, if we want to send them down, then they need some decision-making autonomy. And that is a challenge to enhance capacity, to build capacity. Otherwise, the time it takes to react will not be good enough. If we wait for this device to go back up to the surface, delivers the information 24 hours later, if there is a problem, then it's too late. Real time is essential. And with real time comes that obligation to have decision-making autonomy. Decision-making autonomy means being able to interpret the data that has been measured and to draw a conclusion and take a decision. Today, for underwater sensors, a modern submarine, which is cram-packed with sensors, none of them are humans. Or if there is no human sensor which can drive a nuclear submarine today. These are all sensors with a man operating them. We need a full crew to drive the submarine. That is the tricky thing. One might imagine that is possible. Will be possible one day, and perhaps you can have a crew on a modern submarine with sensors that are not human sensors, steering, reacting to distress or critical situations. So people who imagine decision-making autonomy are very hopeful, and there are some positive indicators that suggest it will be possible to make these devices autonomous. Yeah, this is a very in-depth subject, and we spend a lot of energy, we devote a lot of energy to it, because we've got these artificial intelligence tools that are very powerful. There's a kind of continuum of decision-making autonomy. There are some reflex actions where you have to act really, really quickly, and the slope changes. With these sensors which are on the device, because there are no human beings, you have to be able to react immediately. And these devices move at up to 8 knots, and they can't wait 20 or 30 seconds for an operator on the surface, and there are communication problems. That's not possible, therefore. We have to be able to have an immediate reaction taken by the device. It's a local decision, and then, of course, there can be some circumstances in a mission due to problems with the device or environmental conditions, which mean that one has to reprogram some of the mission. You have to go back to the command post, for example, which has to take certain decisions and see with the operator if you need to reschedule or redesign the mission. So there's a whole chain of decisions that needs to be taken into the consideration. So a question for our ambassador. Can we say that France is lacking in coherency when we're talking about its exploration and its operational strategy for the seabed? Back in 2015, 2018, and at the same time, we have the announcement of a ban on exploiting the seabed. Is this a lack of strategy, or is this in the domain of political decisions? Well, coherency means adapting to a situation. A situation changes, so coherency changes. Yeah, clearly here, this is a political decision that has been taken within the framework of maritime diplomacy. France, well, it's not really a decision, but we do have maritime diplomacy. We have appointed an ambassador for the oceans and for maritime issues. He's called Olivier Poivre d'Arvor. And he is deploying maritime diplomacy hither and thither, on the surface, down on the seabeds, around the poles. And so in my instructions as an ambassador to Jamaica, I have some components of maritime responsibilities, including defending France's interests, and that is within the global framework of French diplomacy. And then there's an environmental framework where France is a spearhead in protecting the environment and fighting against global warming. We know that the oceans are the heat pump of the aircon system of our planet, and if we want to combat global warming efficiently, then there are some one-off actions that need to be carried out, but there is a more general type of protection of the oceans. We have to protect the ocean's ability to absorb excessive heat from the land. So it is part of an overall strategy and policy. So final question. This is a subject which we've already mentioned. And there's another one which I like down here. We're going to talk about this in our meeting on the 24th of November on the question of pleasure submarines, because it's an issue. So, Mark, this is for you. You're a specialist in submarines. How does one regulate submarine navigation when you've got these submarines in the water column? Is it the same as the RIPAM? So what does the Navy do? The collision regulations of 1972. Well, it all depends on this damage which is going to be created insofar as this submarine is under the water. In fact, it behaves like a vessel on the surface. And it's a critical phase for all submarines with their periscopes, where they're kind of between the two. And the submarine is responsible for everything, very vulnerable, but totally responsible. Don't imagine in the short term, given the regulations that exist today, we've talked about those critical infrastructures which are on the seabed. Well, will these seabeds be a danger to them? Well, I don't think there's going to be any regulations on what is visible. Yes, we have mentioned this threat, because it corresponds to a criterion which is unique in this rather opaque maritime world, which is anonymity. We see this in the cyberspace today, and we have created, mankind has created a cyberspace which is very anonymous. And there's another area where that exists, and that is in the underwater domain. And this anonymity is exploited by submarines, and this will have repercussions in diplomacy and politics. Just take a look at the consequences when Nord Stream exploded. We didn't know who it was. You couldn't retaliate politically or militarily. But it's impossible to say who's at fault there. So because there's a lack of regulation, that means that this submarine threat, because the area is very accessible, and because there is this anonymity, it means that there is a very powerful threat, one of the most powerful threats that we know. May I remind you that a few years ago, there's a French and an English vessels in the Atlantic, and there were measures that were taken so that would not happen again. So I believe that there is no legal regulation as we see things today, but in the future, because submarine pilots talk about these boxes. If you're in such and such a zone and you dive, then there are usually no other submarines. But this is a subject which we can talk at our future symposium. It's an interesting question. And as far as civil questions are concerned, there is going to be the obligation to make sure that there is security there. And that's the maritime prefect who is in charge of that. So we will need to take measures to mark off zones, for example. Let's move on. There's an acronym here which I'm not familiar with, the TRL. What is the level of TRL, or what kind of technological bolt is there to limit the depths for exploiting the seabed?
Ah, très bien. Je suis content, j'apprends.
Alain Fidani. It's a bit of a complicated question because underwater drones is just part of the equation in subsea mining. Ever since the beginning of this discussion, we're talking about exploration, and we have an announcement. This is an advert being broadcast. Somebody looking for subscriptions. When we're talking about mining, we're talking about mining vehicles, and the vehicles that will be remote controlled from the surface, that will carry out excavation, that will carry ore to crushers, and the crushers then will take the crushed ore up to the surface. I don't know, maybe the ambassador will contradict me. This really talking about mining. This isn't the kind of vehicle we've been talking about this morning. These vehicles can carry out exploration, analyze the seabed, and carry out and take samples. We're talking about mining. These are completely different types of vehicles. I don't think there's any technological barrier. Today we're on the seabed. We can exploit the seabed down to 6,000 meters. It's a question of money. Oil and gas goes down to 3,000 meters when the price of oil allows it. It'll go down to 6,000 meters if the price of oil is high enough to warrant it. Then in terms of technology, we can put vehicles right down to 6,000 meters. There's no problem there. Okay, very well. It remains for me to thank you, and I think we can give a round of applause.
Vous avez devant vous un
You now have a very happy moderator in front of you because you've been able to appreciate the quality of our speakers. I think France can be very proud of having men and women such as yourselves who are ready to meet the challenges of tomorrow. And I think you have answered very well. I've been able to ask a lot of questions. It's always quite difficult, and this has made this subject very interesting. I'd like to thank all of you for being here in such large numbers. We're very happy to see that. I'm very sorry, and I do apologize for those of you who had to remain standing. I did say that this roundtable was exciting, and we needed a bigger room. We'll try and change that next year on the subject of the seabeds, and enjoy your lunch.